Thank you all very much for coming and joining us this morning. For those of you who may be new to Politica, we're a statewide nonpartisan organization. We focus on state level politics, and we've been leveraging the power of progressive women since 2013. Our mission is to inspire and embolden women to become independent, confident, informed activists and civic leaders, really working for democracy in North Carolina. We accomplish this by demystifying politics and teaching our members useful skills, and then also holding events that put Politica's face-to-face with elected officials at every level of government, from council of state to city council to district court judges to state senators, and even the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. We educate, we communicate, we advocate, and we vote. We're a completely volunteer-run organization, and we were thrilled with what we were able to accomplish in 2020, considering it was 2020, and problematic just because it was 2020. We started the year with one in-person event and then ended up holding 11 virtual events, which was fantastic. We, for the first time ever, we welcomed Council of State candidates to a special two-part sessions entitled Conversations with Council of State Candidates. And I think we were one of the first organizations in the state to do that during that election cycle. We proudly continue our relationship with Braver Angels and You Can Vote, both nonpartisan organizations. We have continued to grow our leadership team, adding Jessica Lamb as our connections leader. And let's see, we have the work of our very committed social media crew has broadened our reach through consistent, high quality content on social media. You can find out information about all of our handles in the chat. And you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter through the website, which information for that will also be in the chat. We only ask for funding to support our efforts, but one time a year, and this is that time. If you want to learn more about how to become a financial supporter, please go to our newly refreshed website, and information is in the chat there. At this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to Frances Bobby. Frances, take it away.
Hi. I am really excited about being the one to test our collective Zoom expertise. Our Zoom master, Rita Watson, has designed a question, and it's a polling question. And most of you will see that polling question pop up right now. And I am going to read you the polling question and give you time to answer it. Now, there are a few of you who logged in through a browser and you might not see it. So I've got it right here. Just raise your hand in chat and I'll show it to you. But our first polling question is, why did you sign up for this event? Number one, I wanted to learn more about the 2021 political roadmap. Number two, I liked the speaker lineup. I wanted to network or see friends online. And then there's the ever popular, my Politica friend made me sign up. So if you'll just answer that, that'll help us understand why you're here and also make sure that our polling feature works. Thank you so much. And I guess it's been, we've got about 20 seconds left. Oh my gosh, I'm so impressed. And I'll tell you that 76%, as you may be seeing, have already said they wanted to learn more about the 2020 roadmap. So I know that our speakers are going to be sharing things that are just really insightful and important with us today. And now you can see the poll results. 76% Number one, I wanted to learn more about the 2021 roadmap and like our speakers for 22%. Thank you so much for answering, and I'll turn it back to Dana.
Great, thanks. I'm glad that there was only one person who responded. My Politica friend made me show up this morning. Thank you anyway. Thanks, Francis, and for everybody for participating in that. It's nice to get everybody to know everybody's engaged at this point. I've been asked to give the most cursory of comments about as introductions for our two speakers today. Dr. David Mclennan is a professor of political science at Meredith College. He is also the director of the Meredith Poll, which is a statewide survey of North Carolinians about politics. Gary Pearce, as we know, is one of the most experienced political observers in North Carolina, and he writes a blog on politics. Many of you may already follow it, entitled newdayfornc.com. He also writes a weekly newspaper column. David, with that, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Dana, and thank you for having us here today. I know many of you, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. Gary and I are going to do more of a conversation about some topics as opposed to formal presentations. So that way we can hit on a number of things. But before we get going, Gary, did you notice how many times Dana worked the word experienced into her remarks? She indicated we're old. So just wanted to note that. So let me just talk. I thought we'd open by Gary talking first about some things he's working on right now before we get into the questions. Then I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm working on right now. And that may give us some context for some discussion questions. Gary, go ahead.
You know, the other definition of experience is the sum of all the mistakes you've made. And by that definition, I'm one of the most experienced people you will ever meet in politics. I tell people I'm a recovering political consultant. I did campaigns for 40 years with Jim Hunt in 1976, and my last real campaign was Cynthia Ball in 2016. And I consider those good bookends to my career. David, what I'm working on right now actually is a blog and a column about what I think is going to happen in 2022 and 2024. And as I've done some research, I came to a strange and different conclusion from what I expected. I went back and looked at presidential elections in North Carolina. I really went back to 1968, 1972, which is when the two-party era really began here. And I noticed a really clear pattern with a break in 2008. Up until 2008, Republicans pretty well dominated the presidential race here. In fact, North Carolina became considered a very safe Republican state, and presidential candidates didn't come here much. Generally, Republicans won by double digits, except when there were Southern candidates named Clinton and Carter on the ballot. And you look at the last two elections in that period, 2004, 2008, George W. Bush won by 12 points both times, even over a Southerner. He won over Al Gore, of course, in 2000. And in 2004, John Edwards from North Carolina was on the ballot, and it didn't make any difference here. But then the world shifted. In 2008, to the surprise of everybody, particularly the Republican candidates at the time, Barack Obama won North Carolina by less than 1 percentage point, but he won it. And so you wonder, why did that happen? And what does that tell us about the future? Well, two things happened. We had the financial crash of 2008, which left an economic recession that many people have still not escaped from. Incredible economic inequality that continues. And since then, the races have been very close. I think Joe Biden lost by 1.6 percentage points this last time. And so what I think is happening is we're going through another crack up, if you will, like we did in 2008. 2020, we had and we still have the COVID pandemic, which has upended our lives. We have the economic fallout from that, which has upended so many lives. And then we've had the end of the Trump presidency, well, the rise and fall, at least fall so far, of the Trump presidency, which is, not to be too partisan, but I am part of it. I think is a movement that's based on hate and authoritarianism, and as we saw at the very end, actually anti-government violence. And there has been a reaction against that among the American people. Yes, he has attracted a lot of people, but polls show that his support, at least in the electorate as a whole, has gone down, while his support in the Republican Party has probably gone up. So my prediction is that what you're going to see in 2022 and 24 is not sort of a straight line continuation of what happened in the past. I think there is the potential, and I stress potential, for a very dramatic shift toward Democrats, toward more progressive policies. You look at polls, the stimulus, the $1.9 trillion stimulus, unbelievable amount of money, is very popular with voters, if not with Republicans in Congress. $15 minimum wage is very popular with voters. Last year, Florida, in a statewide referendum, passed a $15 minimum wage, even while electing Republicans and voting for Trump. And even the idea of a guaranteed basic income is very popular. So I think Democrats are on the right side of those issues. I think Republicans are on the wrong side. I think they have consigned themselves to a cult that is built around one man, and I think that is going to dictate some big changes in politics in the upcoming cycle.
Thanks, Gary. We'll pursue some of those topics in our questions in the next few minutes, but I'll just tell everybody a little bit of what I'm working on. My academic research is about women in politics, and this year I'm publishing the newest edition of the Status of Women in North Carolina Politics report. That should be out in April. And the message is kind of mixed. In certain offices, women made great strides since 2018. 2018 was the worst, between 2018 and 2020, the worst time period for women in elected office across the state in almost 20 years. But the election of 2020 produced some progress for women in elected office. And really what the numbers indicate is that North Carolina is very divided between urban and rural. That's no surprise to those of you who study politics that there's a huge divide. For example, the mayors of the largest cities in North Carolina are women. Women in the General Assembly have ticked upward, but there's still some problems in women being in elected office. The most concerning office in North Carolina continues to be boards of county commissioners. So women are least represented there than almost any other particular position. So that report will be coming out in April, and you'll be able to see the results from all my analysis of the 2020 election, but also the current situation. We'll have a spring poll coming out in just a couple of weeks, and we're looking at some of the questions that Gary indicated. We're looking at a lot of policy questions, what North Carolinians think about raising the minimum wage, what North Carolinians think about expanding Medicaid. But we're also doing a deep dive into this question of authoritarianism. We want to get at what do North Carolinians feel about an authoritarian kind of government, and also political violence. One of the concerns that the FBI is continuing to express at the national level is that January 6th was not an isolated event. So we're going to try to get at the idea of what do North Carolinians feel about whether political violence is acceptable. So anyway, that's kind of some stuff I'm working on. And if it's okay with you, I will dive into the questions. I will both moderate and participate during the questions. So the first question I'm going to let Gary start with, and then I'll jump in, and then we'll go back and forth. So the first question is, Gary, the 2020 elections results. What do you think that means in terms of this year, 2022, and 2024? I'd like you to build a little bit on what you just talked about in your opening remarks. What do the specific election results mean going forward? We saw, for example, Republicans do quite well with the exception of Governor Cooper.
You know, one thing I think they mean, you have to always be careful about drawing too broad lessons. But I think if Democrats in North Carolina could go back and change one thing about next year, and they certainly want to change it the next couple of years, they want to go back to knocking on doors. You know, that doesn't sound very exciting, but I do think that the electorate in North Carolina is much more in tune with what Lord Cooper's priorities are than with Phil Berger's priorities, as an example. You know, we've had a Republican legislature since 2010, primarily, well, not primarily, solely because there was a fluke election in 2010. That was the Tea Party year. It was Obama's first midterm election. There was a reaction against Obamacare and the stimulus package at the time. Republicans won the legislature, and they've kept it, and basically have kept it with a pretty ruthless practice of gerrymandering and voter suppression. And during all this time, you go back really to 1992 when Jim Hunt was elected to his third term. Every single cycle, North Carolinians have elected a Democratic governor whose priorities are education, healthcare, environmental protection, equality, opportunity for all. There was only one exception, that was 2012. And that year, Beverly Perdue pulled out really late in the race, put Walter Dalton in a bad position, and Pat McCrory won. McCrory went down the line with the Republican legislature, and he promptly lost in 2016. So my argument is that Cooper's priorities are what North Carolinians believe in. But, you know, I think Democrats were really disappointed. They had hoped 2020 was the year that they would break the majority in one house or the other, and they failed to. And part of that was gerrymandering. A big part of it was because of the pandemic. Democrats did not do the kind of face-to-face, door-to-door campaigning that had worked well for them before. So now they're stuck here, and they feel like it'll be a couple more cycles. So I think what the election leaves is sort of this gridlock, and the perfect example of it is legislature passed a bill that says schools have to go back to in-person classes. The governor vetoed it yesterday. And now the question is whether enough Democrats will stick with the governor in the House to uphold his veto, or if they'll override it. And if all these Republicans who say they believe in local control will in fact force every school in North Carolina to do what they dictate in Raleigh.
I would agree with what Gary said. I think a couple other data points worth considering from 2020. First, he mentioned Donald Trump. And Donald Trump does a couple of things for North Carolina voters. One, he causes overperformance of white, non-college educated people. And so we saw that at the polls, at the ballot box in 2020. And again, that happened in 2016 as well. And so I think the question going forward, without Donald Trump on the ballot, in 2022, we'll wait and see whether he's on the ballot in 2024, is will North Carolina return to what we saw in 2018, which is a year Democrats did better, if you look across the legislative ballot and that sort of thing, or will, in 2024 in particular, will Republicans continue to overperform with that particular demographic group? The other data point I think worth mentioning is that we're all aware that Democrats are doing better in urban areas, but not all urban areas performed equally well in 2020. Wake County had about an 80% voter turnout rate but Mecklenburg County had a 70% turnout rate. And so, had Mecklenburg County turned out to the same degree as Wake County, we might have seen Democrats do a little bit better, particularly for Council of State and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, for example. So I think there are a number of residual questions from 2020 about where North Carolina is going. I think Gary's right. The long-term demographic trends in North Carolina point toward more favorable things for Democrats. The electorate aligns on issues better with Democratic issues. So I think, again, Democrats in the meeting today should feel good in the long term. I just have questions in the short term. Gary, second question. So you alluded to this, but what are the major policy issues facing the legislature and the governor now? You mentioned the reopening of schools, but there's some other big ticket items that we will see debated in coming weeks. What are they?
Somebody who follows the legislature closer than I do would have to tell you that. I think obviously what's going to happen with Medicaid expansion, education funding, whether the legislature will ever get back to funding the public schools fairly, or if they're going to continue, which I expect, to siphon tax dollars over to private schools, particularly for-profit schools that some of their donors own. I don't, I've been looking at the chat, and a couple people have asked about nonpartisan redistricting and that sort of thing. I don't think we're going to see that as long as the Republicans are in control. I think the only way you're going to see it is if Democrats win the legislature and keep their promise, which is what Republicans did not do. They had promised to go to nonpartisan redistricting, and they've broken that promise ever since. I don't, one of the things I'm really watching here nationally, a couple of your comments have reflected this, is really the fundamental question of democracy, which comes down to a choice between, are we going to make it easier for people to vote, or are we going to make it harder for people to vote? There's House Bill 1 in Washington that tries to make it easier to vote. I know that Georgia has given what happened to Georgia, the response of the Republican Party is not how do we improve our messaging, how do we reach people better. It's how do we keep all these Democrats from voting? How do we make it harder? For example, by banning voting on Sunday mornings, which is deliberately targeting black churches. I don't know if the Republicans are going to try to do the same thing here. I expect so. And I think the other thing to watch is very interesting. Republicans are in no hurry to draw new districts for next year. And that is very deliberate. They want to do it as late as possible to give Democrats as little time as possible to recruit candidates, to know what districts they're running in, and to prepare campaigns, while Republicans know what they're going to do. They're getting their candidates ready. So it's a classic case of elections have consequences. The Republicans control the levers of power and redistricting and who gets to vote, and I think that becomes a self-continuing thing.
I think you're right that elections and democracy are really, we're at a crossroads. 308 bills have been filed across the country since 2016 by primarily Republicans at the state level to put some kind of restriction on voting. We saw not only Georgia, but now Arizona is considering a real change in its election practices, but many other states. And so the question I have is, will the Republican leadership in the General Assembly try to change what has been the practice in North Carolina for quite some time to have no excuse absentee balloting? That has been, obviously in 2020, a huge boon to all voters. And we've seen that no excuse absentee voting, what we call mail-in voting, and even early voting has been on the increase since both were implemented. So the question is, will Republicans file an anti-democratic bill? The other is social issues. Larry Pittman filed a bill yesterday on abortion. And the bill, which I don't think will pass, and I'd love to hear Representative Ball and Representative Von Hafen address this, and Gary, you as well, that trying to make it illegal for someone to have an abortion after fertilization. And I'm no medical expert, but I think that pretty much eliminates abortion. So anyway, I don't think that bill will pass, but I think, I'm more concerned about these wedge issues, these cultural issues that will come up during the legislative session. So I think there are a lot of things, like Gary indicated, Medicaid expansion. The Republicans certainly don't have a lot of appetite for that, but again, the push is there. So one of the questions I have, and Gary, I'd like to hear you respond to this, is the state is reporting over a $4 billion surplus, more revenues coming in than were anticipated for COVID. What do you think is going to happen with that?
But David, before I answer that, I want to speak to one thing you just brought up, and that's wedge issues. I think the school reopening bill, is nothing more than a wedge issue. It was interesting to me that a lot of the Republican reaction to Governor Cooper's veto was, he's done something that's not popular. I think the purpose of that bill was to drive a wedge between teachers and parents. And, the pandemic has certainly sort of laid the groundwork for that. And so I think that's more of a wedge issue. And I think that shows you sort of their priority. So the same thing for the $4 billion. I don't think they're going to do with it what they ought to do with it, which is, the one thing the government does well, and I know this now as a Social Security recipient, is send checks. The best thing the government could do right now, state government and federal government, is send people some of their money back. Even if it's money that comes from Art Pope and the people at the top. I mean, you can call that redistribution or socialism or whatever it is. But people are having a tough time right now. North Carolina, and since 2010, the legislature has instituted one of the stingiest, meanest, cheapest unemployment insurance systems in the country. I mean, it really is cruel. And we have so many people who have lost work or underemployed or can't make enough money. That's where that money ought to be spent. And I seriously doubt that's where this legislature will spend it.
I know the governor has indicated that he'd like to spend some money not only on COVID relief and COVID response, but to help small businesses. I think he's talked about earmarking some of that $400 million or so, at least to small businesses. And as Gary indicated, we've seen small businesses across the state, really be devastated by COVID. So, again, but we're also seeing talk from the legislative leaders about things like the rainy day fund, which, again, we're not near the top in terms of states' savings accounts. And so there could be an argument made that the next pandemic is only years away or months away. So I think that's a really important question, but I think you're right, Gary, that is a wedge issue. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's pursue this idea of redistricting. We saw the Census Bureau is going to be late in releasing the census numbers from the 2020 census, which is going to affect reapportionment. So even though we believe North Carolina is going to get an additional member of Congress in the House of Representatives, the lateness of the releasing of the census data affects reapportionment, but more specifically affects the drawing of lines such that it could bump into filing periods for the 2021 municipal elections, or even affect the 2021 municipal elections, but also could affect filing for congressional elections in 2022. Gary, do you have any insight into, just from a campaign perspective, what the late release of the census data might indicate?
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record, and I apologize, but I think it is a broken record. The reason the census data is late is the Trump administration deliberately undermined the census process. And so now that's spilling over into election uncertainty. And I think the common theme here is anti-democracy, not the anti-democratic party, although that's the effect, but it's fundamentally anti-democracy. They undermined the public health system, reaction to COVID health. Probably hundreds of thousands of people in America died because of that. They messed with the census to make it impossible to fairly count how many Americans there are and fairly represent the population of this country. And then he put a North Carolina man in charge of screwing up the mail, the post office. Fortunately, it didn't seem to totally destroy the election, although it probably hurt it. But it has really interfered with our lives and has the potential. So I think you just see this continuing effort to undermine and deny democracy. And I think, all these issues are very important, but I'm not sure there's a more important issue, not just in the country, but in the world. I mean, you look now at what's happening in Russia, the repression against people who have the courage to stand up for democracy. And you look at a lot of these international measures of democracy. Democracy is in retreat around the world and in our own country. And I think that's something we need to look at all of this through that lens.
Yeah, and I'm concerned just from a basic democracy perspective about having the possibility of municipal elections postponed. I know those are low turnout elections across North Carolina generally, but the idea of uncertainty is never good for voters and as well as candidates and parties and all those kind of things. But even the uncertainty around particular congressional and legislative seats in terms of, as Gary said much earlier, recruiting candidates. I've spoken to a number of people who are interested in running in 2022. But who are expressing real concern that they don't know if and when they put their life on hold to get involved in that electoral process. So I think the uncertainty is very concerning, and it's often more concerning for the party not in power, because they're running often against incumbents. Gary,
could I make another
Sure.
point about that? Because Politica, one of your purposes is to get people involved in politics. And what David said there is exactly right. That uncertainty about when will the election be or what might my district be discourages people like you from getting in politics. It's tough enough as it is. I spent, like I said, many years working with candidates, and there are a lot of politicians I didn't like. But one thing I admire about all of them is they're willing to make the sacrifice of time and the financial sacrifice to do that. So people like Cynthia and Louis Meyer and Julie on here who do that can't get enough credit and thanks for being willing to do that. And anything like this that makes it more difficult for you to consider taking that enormous step. I mean, it's just a life-changing step of subjecting yourself to the slings and arrows of a political campaign is not good.
Yeah, and so we hope that in future years there will be more competence coming out of the Biden administration, so we won't have things like we're seeing now. Let's switch gears a little bit, Gary, and talk about polling. I'll take this first, and I wanted to plead the fifth on this because I am a pollster. But status of polling. My observation about polling is exactly what I said earlier. Why did pollsters have more difficulty in 16 and 20 than they did in 18? And I think I'll speak frankly. We continue to underestimate the Trump factor in terms of turning out rural, non-college educated whites. So we adjusted our models after 2016. We heard all the criticism. In 2020, still had some challenges. The biggest miss in North Carolina for all the pollsters, not just my polling organization, was the U.S. Senate race. All the polling organizations, with one exception, showed Tom Tillis in a lot more trouble than he ended up being in. I'm not one of those who think that necessarily that Cal Cunningham's extramarital situation shifted tremendous numbers of voters. I believe that it had some effect on the margins. I think we were off for most of the election cycle. So, going forward, 2018, the Meredith poll, the Elon poll, all the polls in North Carolina were spot on. We did do a good job then. So my question going forward in 2022 and particularly in 2024 is, what's going to happen with the electorate? Is it going to be, again, overperformance in certain parts of the electorate or not? So I have heard enough of the criticism of polling to know there's a lot of anger out there, but pollsters are always trying to get it right. Gary, any thoughts?
I love pollsters, David, and I still love pollsters. But I tell you, I'd qualify that. I love good pollsters and good polls. And from doing this for 40 years, I know what it takes to do a good poll. And it's like everything else in politics, it takes money. The problem with most polls you read publicly, media polls, is they're done on the cheap. Somebody wants to say, well, how, and a lot of campaigns do the same thing. I don't know how many campaigns I've been in. I'll sit down with somebody who's looking to run statewide, and I'll say, well, first thing you need to do is poll. Because you think you know what people think, but you don't. You got to go talk to them and not base it on anecdote or your opinion, which is probably wrong. And they say, well, that's good. I'd like to do a poll. What does it cost? What I say to them right now is a good statewide poll costs $40,000. And inevitably, somebody in the room says, oh, well, my brother-in-law knows somebody. They can do it for $4,000. And so they do it for $4,000, and then they go out and they raise, let's say, $1 million, and they spend it all wrong because they spent $4,000 on the poll instead of $40,000. Good polls work, but you got to invest in them, which means you have to call back. You have to reach everybody. You can't just depend on an automatic poll, a robo poll that can't call cell phones. I mean, that's ridiculous today. You've got to throw in some internet polling, and you have to do focus groups. So you understand, in a poll, people can only answer the questions the way I word them. A focus group tells me how they think and talk about politics, and that's important to understand. And in terms of polling, I remember about a week before the election, I talked to one of Governor Cooper's advisors about how it looked. At the time, every poll was showing him winning by double digits. And he said, it's not going to happen. He said, the important thing in this poll is that Governor Cooper has been consistently at 53, 52, 53, 54% in the polls. That's where we're going to end up. And that's where he ended up. People, oh my God, he'd been ahead by double digits. Well, not in the Cooper campaign's polling. David, I disagree with you a little bit about Cal Cunningham. I think he had a chance to win, and you go back and look at the results. I forget the numbers, but Tillis ran pretty significantly behind Donald Trump in North Carolina, and you think about it, it's obvious why. He had made both sides mad. At one point, he showed a little independence from Trump, and then he came, back on his knees. And so he lost with both sides. And so he fell short. And I think Cunningham had a chance. I think Cunningham's problem was he built his campaign on character. And then in the last month of the campaign, he totally undermined the character argument, and he had nothing left. And so that was a terrible missed opportunity for Democrats. You think about it, this wouldn't be a 50-50 Senate. It'd be a clear 51-49 Senate. Joe Manchin would be a little bit less powerful than he is now, or Susan Collins, if we had won that race. So that was a terrible loss for Democrats, and a terribly significant loss.
I agree with you there. We've got just a few minutes before the Q&A. So Gary, last question. I'm going to have you prognosticate about the future of both parties. So we're seeing the Republican Party. We hear this talk of civil war within the Republican Party. We saw Richard Burr censured after his vote for impeachment. But we also know that Democrats are somewhat divided on the national level between the progressives and the moderates. So heading into 2024, what do you think both parties are facing? And the follow-up is, who do you think they're going to nominate for key offices like the U.S. Senate seat to replace Richard Burr?
Oh, that's a pretty tough one. I think the Civil War in the Republican Party is over and Trump won. They have decided that I think most every Republican is either agrees with the MAGA crowd that stormed the Capitol or is so afraid of it they won't cross it. So as much as I hate to say it, I think 2022 and 2024 will once again, like the last three elections, be basically about Donald Trump. And I hope that people have seen enough, that they don't want any part of it, that they're going to punish the Republican Party, and that the Democratic Party is going to be able to hold itself together and sort of, patch over any divisions by agreeing the most important thing in this country is to keep Trump from becoming president again, to keep the Republicans from taking Congress, and keep a crowd of violent thugs from taking over our country. I think that the stakes are literally that high.
Any thoughts as to what that means for the Republican primary for U.S. Senate in 2024?
Well, it's who's the most Trump. And it's hard to beat Laura Trump. If she moves from New York and comes to North Carolina, but you can see they're all falling over themselves. And I want to, because I've been so partisan, I do want to say one thing. I actually respect Richard Burr. I just wrote a column about him this week, which I invite you to go look at. And I had two theories for his vote. One is that it was revenge, that he blamed Donald Trump for putting the FBI on investigating him for insider stock trading. And that investigation was revenge, Trump's revenge for Burr chairing the Senate Intelligence Committee report on the 2016 election. But Burr did chair that report, and it didn't get the attention it deserves. And I invite you to Google it and look at part of it, because they went into great detail about what Russia did in 2016, how effective it was in influencing the election, and how closely coordinated the Russians were with the Trump campaign. And so I give Richard Burr credit for some statesmanship. Yeah, he's retiring. He doesn't have to worry about it. But he could have just as easily said, okay, well, it doesn't matter. Trump's going to get off. I'll do it. And for him to stand up on the floor in the face of all the Republicans and say guilty, and he was the first Republican senator to vote guilty, by the way, that day, and then be willing to go through what he's going through now, I think really is an example of courage, and I salute him for that. I'm way off the topic of your question, I'm afraid, David.
That's okay. But again, I think you really kind of got at it. Richard Burr does not have as many supporters in North Carolina as he did. And so, in terms of who's going to replace him, I agree with you completely that if it's not Laura Trump, and there have been conflicting media reports about whether she will or will not run, then the question is, who is the most Trumpy of the remaining Republicans? And, I think to me, Gary's spot on that North Carolina has moved fully into MAGA territory. The election of Madison Cawthorn in the 11th district over a very well-established Republican in the primary, indicates that. And the lieutenant governor, that was the biggest surprise to me on someone who literally made his entire campaign based on that one speech he made in Greensboro about Second Amendment, who was elected lieutenant governor. So, the question is, will someone emerge? Dan Bishop is being rumored, that sort of thing. So I don't know. The Democratic side's kind of interesting to me because, I think the News Observer, the Charlotte Observer had probably a long list of candidates being rumored to run. I don't know what the Democrats are going to do, whether they'll take a chance on a younger Jeff Jackson, who's still, from my perspective, a very young man, a very accomplished man, but a young man, or whether they'll go in a different direction. So I'd love to hear, Gary, your thoughts on the Democratic side as we wrap up.
And I realize I did sort of duck that when somebody asked it in the chat. I do want to address that. Jeff Jackson is young. I do remember that when Jim Hunt ran for governor, he was 39 years old. And I do have a strong belief that we need younger candidates. And Jackson is a smart and energetic guy. A lot of people I know, including people in the legislature, say, well, he's too ambitious. Somebody told me, well, Jeff Jackson's biggest problem is a lot of the legislators and lobbyists don't like him. And I said, well, the voters might really like to hear that. That might be the kind of candidate they want. But I tell you one thing, he is very skilled on social media. He has got himself a gimmick, which is he's out there running now, running hard. He's going to go to all 100 counties and talk to people. That's an interesting thing. I think there is a deep desire in the Democratic Party for a different kind of candidate. There's a strong feeling that we ought to have a black statewide candidate, a woman statewide candidate. And so many people are looking at Sherry Beasley. And I've talked to her. I know she's looking at it. She's considering it. But I'll tell you the same thing I told her, which is, yes, you've made a statewide race for Chief Justice. A race for the Senate is a different level altogether. I mean, you're talking about a race where you have to raise literally tens of millions of dollars. It becomes a national campaign. It is a key battleground state. Running for judge, with all due respect, Judge Meyer, but running for judge is a much more polite thing. When you're running for judge, you get away with saying, well, I can't really talk about any issues because I might have to rule on them. You've got to talk about issues. And that would be a big step for her. But I mean, those are the two candidates out now. I doubt anybody else is going to get in. Be surprised. Okay. But I think, you get out and you see who does well. That's what campaigns are for.
All right. Thank you. Gentlemen. Dana, let's turn it over to you for Q&A, or anybody who's moderating. And I wasn't sure who's going to moderate, so I'm going to leave y'all time.
Thanks so much, David. Let's get a couple of questions. Lynn, do you have questions selected from the chat?
I do. One of our first questions that came in the chat was about the Equal Rights Amendment. This person says, we've been trying to get this done in North Carolina for the last 5 years, and we can't even get it to have a hearing. Gary's already shaking his head. I see that. But the question is there any hope for the ERA in North Carolina?
Here's the reason I was shaking my head. You said for the last 5 years. No, I've seen this battle for about the last 40 years. In Governor Hunt's first term, ERA came very close to passing in North Carolina. In fact, it came within one vote in the Senate. And at the time, it wasn't quite as partisan an issue. There were a fair number of Republicans. And David, I could be wrong about this, but I believe that Governor Holshouser, who was in office from 72 to 76, a Republican, supported ERA. Yep, I know Betty and Gerald Ford supported ERA. And we came within literally one vote in the Senate of getting it passed in North Carolina. And that one vote was Senator R.C. Soules, who just died from Columbus County, and Governor Hunt had leaned on him pretty hard for his vote, and Soules said, well, let me think about it. I'm going to go home this weekend. He came back the next week and he said, I can't vote for it. My mother is against it. So it didn't pass. And in fact, when he died a couple of weeks ago, he said well, before he died, he said in an interview that his greatest regret from all the years, and he was there for something like 30 years, was he voted against it. So, I think the question is, can you get a Republican to support it? I doubt it. I think things are so polarized, but if you could get one or two Republicans to switch over, maybe you could. But it has been a long and disappointing and disheartening battle.
Thank you, Gary. Randy, do you have a question?
Yes, we all know how important the Senate seat is. So many people we've talked about this, but just how do you view the chances for Democrats winning Pearce seat next year? And also, what steps need to be taken and which groups are most active and effective in bringing about this result?
David, do you want to start with?
Sure. If you go back to 1950 until now, you see that there really are almost an equal number of Republicans and Democrats who have served in the U.S. Senate from North Carolina. So we shouldn't discount history. In recent years, obviously, it's been more challenging. But I think it's not a presidential election year, which could make it a little bit better, particularly if Trump is on the ballot in 2024. But I think what we've seen is the national Senate campaign committees have targeted North Carolina for the last few cycles. This is going to be a multi-$100-million campaign between the money raised by the candidates and the money from outside organizations. So, it's going to be a very expensive, loud campaign. I think what Gary was just getting at is, Democrats may be well served to have a different sort of candidate, younger, of color, whatever it may be, because I know that through polling, the energy in the North Carolina Democrats is coming in part from the younger people. I mean, we saw a great turnout in North Carolina in 2020 from young people. They finally turned out. But I think the type of candidate that Democrats run is going to be very important for that kind of turnout remaining.
David, I think it could be a good year for Democrats. If you look back, again, sort of the same era I've been talking about, the only Democrats who have won Senate races were Terry Sanford, John Edwards, and Kay Hagan. And none of them won re-election. Either lost or, in Edwards' case, ran for something else and lost. But just as I go back to what I said at the opening, I think there is a chance for Democrats this year because I think the country's changing. I think a Democrat needs to be more progressive, more liberal, even if you would. I would say if I was a Democrat, I'd want to run on. The problem with the $1.9 trillion stimulus is it wasn't big enough. We got to raise the minimum wage to $15. We need to look at guaranteed basic income. We always think, and particularly those of us in politics, think in terms of political things like the filibuster or the Supreme Court or something like that. With voters, it's always two things that they care about. They care about their families and their jobs. And particularly in times like this, they barely have enough bandwidth left to think about anything else. So I think Democrats need to talk to that, need to address those concerns, and they need to raise the threat of what Trumpism stands for. And what was the famous tweet that Trump sent the day of the attack on the Capitol? He said, "Remember this day forever." Well, that's one thing I agree with him on. I think Democrats ought to remind people forever of those images of those thugs breaking into the Capitol and beating a policeman with an American flag. I just think people have had enough of that, and a candidate who can articulate that. And as David said, all you got to do is raise a couple $100 million.
Thank you, Gary. Lynn, do we have another question from the chat?
I do. It goes back to we talked about how close Biden came, but someone's wanting to know why did we not have more quote coattail wins off of Cooper for our state delegation? Where were all those voters, and why did we not bring some along with Governor Cooper?
I think Cooper was sort of benefited from a couple things. Gary sort of indicated about policy issues, but I also think Roy Cooper benefited in ways that other candidates did not, and that he was the guy who led us through hurricanes and COVID. And so I think people may have crossed over and voted for Cooper because of the leadership he showed during those kind of situations that would not have voted for Democrats. We see that across the country, and that many governors who led through crises like COVID did well. Only one incumbent governor did not. So, I think we shouldn't discount that Cooper, even though he may have wanted and may have tried to help in whatever capacity, could have other Democrats, he was just in a very unique circumstance.
Yeah, the coattails that really counted this time were Trump's coattails. As David said, where a lot of the polls missed the election was they didn't realize there were still a lot more white working class votes that Trump could bring out for whatever reason. And then surprisingly enough, David, you may know more about these numbers. It appears that Trump also was able to pick up some Hispanic votes. I don't think in the end he really was able to pick up any black votes like people thought, but he did shift some Hispanic votes, and he brought out more white working class voters. And the strongest motivator, two great motivators in politics, hate and fear. And Trump, I once asked a good Republican friend of mine, very smart guy, very conservative person. I asked him to explain Trump's appeal to me. He said it is very simple. He's fighting the people they hate. And that's a long list of people. And so that hate brought out a lot of people. What Cooper was able to do, and coattails don't count here, but these are people I want to hear explain. I want somebody to explain to me the Trump-Cooper voter. And I think it's probably they said, well, Cooper did a good job on the pandemic. He seems to understand what we're going through. I've seen him doing the job. I trust him a lot. And then I'll take it another step. Somebody explained to me the Trump, Cooper, Mark Robinson vote, because they are out there. And I urge you to pay attention to the Mark Robinson, and also to the appointment of the new chancellor at Fayetteville State. What elected Mark Robinson was the gun lobby, and also a very strong private school lobby that uses people like him and the new chancellor at Fayetteville State to argue for school vouchers. And they get a lot of money and a lot of attention, and that is a coming thing at the Republican Party.
Thank you, Gary. Randy, do we have time for one more question, I think?
Yes, you all have addressed this a little already, but what would you say are the most important issues for young voters as we look forward to the upcoming elections?
Well, when I ask them, and I do almost every day in class, they'll give you a very progressive litany of issues. Climate is first. And these are my more conservative students as well as my more liberal students. Equality, the equality bill that was passed this week in the U.S. House to give the LGBTQ plus community more legal protections was cheered widely. Healthcare, believe it or not, young people care maybe not as much about healthcare as our group, but they care. So it's the kind of thing where we tend to focus on things like debt forgiveness, free college. They're smarter than you give them credit for. they think that's kind of pie in the sky, but they're looking at kind of the issues that Gary outlined, things that affect them and their families.
I agree. I agree with that because they're all in a situation. A lot of them do have student debt. They're not looking for forgiveness, but what they want is a chance to get a decent job, decent salary. I think they're concerned about things about minimum wage, but they're concerned about jobs and their own hopes for families and house and all that. The biggest difference I see, David, you hit this nail right on the head between younger voters and our generation, if you will, is they have a real concern about climate change, and they are deeply committed to equality and fairness and an end to discrimination. And that to me is, those two things are very encouraging because I think, we tend to, I don't know if it's because our time horizons are shorter or what, we don't pay enough attention to climate change. But you look at what happened in Texas over the last couple of weeks, it comes directly out of that. It has a direct impact on us in North Carolina. So more power to them, and I just wish more of them voted.
Lynn, I think we may have time for one more question if you have one available.
I do not, because I thought that was our final. I can look at that quickly, and if you want to come back to me.
Or I would ask one, which is just, I think voting rights and the fact that all the laws that made easier for people to vote in November are now gone deeply concerns me and others. What do you think we can do on that front?
Elect Democrats. I mean, look, this is a fundamental difference between the two parties. The Republican Party has committed itself to a course of making it harder for people, particularly people who don't look like me, to vote. And Democrats, and this is not just this year, it's the reason I'm a Democrat ever since I got in politics. It's always been one story. There's always been a group of people, whether it's blacks and civil rights, women in the ERA back in the 70s and today, LGBTQ community, immigrants, whatever, people trying to get into the system and trying to have an opportunity. And it's always Democrats who are trying to knock down barriers and open doors, and it is always Republicans who are slamming doors shut.
Thank you, Gary. Just as a reminder to all of our guests today, we are a nonpartisan organization.
I'm not nonpartisan.
And we don't typically recommend one way or the other, but thank you for your comments. Any last remarks, David, before we close out?
Well, I think, many of the comments we made today kind of go back to activism. And I think the last comment about how do we protect democracy goes back to activism. I mean, I see League of Women Voters folks here. I work pretty closely with Advance Carolina. Both of the organizations are telling the story about voter suppression and about the importance of democracy. I would say if you are not part of those organizations or do not follow those organizations, follow them, because they are out there every day. And I think that's what it's going to take, is for more North Carolinians to understand the linkage between laws that suppress the vote or actions that suppress the vote and policy outcomes. So I think support those organizations and others like them that do the work on the ground.
And could I just add to that, thank you all for what you do and for your interest, and keep it up, because it makes a difference.
I'd like to thank our special guests, Gary Pearce and Dr. David Mclennan, for giving us an incredibly insightful and informative program today and sharing their knowledge. I'd also like to thank our Politica volunteers who helped make this possible and make it run smoothly. Finally, just to remind you guys that we've got a couple more events coming up, one on design apps on March 9th, and we have a social on March 16th. You can find out lots of information about our events by following us on Facebook and Instagram and going to our website. We'd also like to to remind you that if you haven't renewed your membership or if you've never joined us, please do. There should be a post in the chat giving you a link to our website where you can become a member, and we use your support to put on events like this every year. So thank you once again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Remember, educate, communicate, advocate, and vote.